Hello, I'm Arthur. Welcome to my lab. Recently I posted a video about using quad extrusion, and this is the adapter, the Y adapter that I used for my quad extrusion. But let's start simpler. Let's start with dual extrusion, and this is the adapter that we'll use for this. This is the first adapter that I tried, and it worked very nice. So that's what you need. This adapter plus obviously two extruders and one hot end, because this sends two different filaments into one hot end. So that's pretty much all you need hardware wise, and of course some way of mounting your filament spools on your printer, just two hangers or something. And this is the kind of things that you can print with dual color. So you see a lot of videos on YouTube about how to use multiple colors, but all they do is print traffic cones where they switch color on a layer boundary. With this setup here, you can truly have dual color prints where you use two colors at the same time. So let's pop this into my printer and then see how this is configured in software.
Let's start with the changes that need to be made to the configuration H in your Marlin software. You need to do the define extruders 2. This is normally set at 1, or it may be commented out. I'm not sure, I don't remember, but I'll make sure that this is uncommented and that it says define extruders 2. Define single nozzle, because we'll be using a single nozzle for both extruders. And this is not really necessary, but it's helpful. Define distinct E factors, and what this does is it allows you to define different factors for your extruders. So instead of setting, like in older Marlin firmware, you could only set one steps per unit for extruder, and it would be applied to all of your extruders. In newer Marlin, I'm using version 1.1.4. In newer Marlin, you can again define distinct E factors, and then you can set your steps per unit separately for each extruder, which is awesome, because if you have two different extruders, let's say that for some crazy reason you have a dual hot end and dual extruder, and in one you use 3mm filament and in the other you use 1.75. Steps are different, everything's totally different. You can just set that up. I don't know why you would want to do that, but whatever. The point is that you can. So again, default axis steps per unit, you define both of them, so there will be only one number here at the end. For your single extruder, you add the second number, and you'll have to figure out what those numbers are, obviously. If you're not using the same exact extruder as I do, then these numbers will be totally different for you. Default max feed rate, again, you need to, there will be just one number, there will be like three numbers, X, Y, Z, and extruder, and you need to add the second number for the second extruder. And the same for max acceleration, X, Y, Z, and first extruder, and you add comma and the second extruder. So that's the changes that you need to make in Marlin firmware for dual extrusion. Compile, upload to your board, and you should be good to go. Now, for the filament changes, and this is work in progress, I'm still trying to figure out what's the best approach, and this is my first approach to this. I know that I will be changing this, but just to get you started, just to get you going and experimenting, this is what you need to do. For your end G code, if you use Slicer, if you use anything else, you're on your own, sorry, but if you use Slicer, you go to print settings or printer settings tab, and in your custom G code here for end G code, you add the following bit. This one, I believe this portion is already there by default, and you add this portion here. So basically you send your nozzle to Y position of 100 with this feed rate, whatever, then you pull out the old filament, set that to filament position 0, make sure that the tool is set to tool 0. Again, reset the filament position. This is redundant, but just to make sure. And then feed the filament in. So this portion of the code, just make sure that when you finish your print, your dual nozzle or dual extrusion is preloaded with the first extruder, with the filament from the first extruder, so that when you start the next print, you know that it's the first extruder's filament that's in the nozzle and not randomly whatever was the last filament used. So that's why this. And then for your tool change code, you need to add this. In my case, these numbers, the X and Y numbers, will be different, will depend on your printer's geometry. But in my case, I sent my print head to position X130 and Y200 just to make sure that I don't hit any clips that are holding down my print glass, print surface. So this is still within the area of within the printable area. And then I go to Y230 because I know that if I move straight up from Y200 to Y230 at X position 130, then I'm not going to hit any clips holding down my glass. Then again, I withdraw the current filament. Then I switch to the next extruder and I feed in the same amount of filament. That's the length of filament that I figured out was the correct length. And actually, forget this. This is just a comment. This was from a previous test, so that's not needed anymore. So you just feed the same amount, and then I've noticed that once my print got the extruders confused, it switched to the wrong extruder. So just to make sure that I'm on the previous extruder, I added this here, and then actually the next command that's generated by Slicer will be to switch to the next extruder. So that's gonna work for you. So again, this is Marlin. That's where you do your firmware. This is Slicer. This is where you set up your tool changes. Let's see what else. I did a Z lift so that there's no debris on my print. I decided to try lifting Z, and by 2mm, which is pretty big, I might reduce this, but I think the print will be cleaner if you do this. So that's one change that I made, and I did this for both my extruders, and that's pretty much it. There's nothing else exciting in here. So that's that, and with that we can set up our print. And the way I set up my print is that I have these two dump towers, this one and this one, which are just two horizontal long bars, and then my my nozzle will go to this position somewhere here to change the filament, then come back, hit my bar first, and eject filament here until, so that I designed these bars to be such length that the old color gets purged out by just printing this bar. And then my hot end will move to this object, which is my test. So just individual components of the test, and you set up your dual color by just assigning different extruders. So see, this is one of my dump towers is assigned to extruder number 2. The other dump tower is assigned to extruder number 1. One of the sections of this printed object is assigned to extruder number 2. So is this one, and then the other two sections are assigned to extruder number 1. And then in Slicer, of course, you just select your temperatures, you make sure that you select your correct printer. So I created a new printer just for testing dual X, and then you run your G code. And actually I may need to rerun this just to show you one bit that's handy. So I'm going to run this slicer, and yeah, you'll get this pop-up warning. Just click on no. That's because all these objects are so close to each other, they overlap. So what happens is that slicer will generate these commands for both tools, both T0 and T1. But T1 is a fake hot end, so you need to get rid of this line here that mentions T1, and this line right here, M109, that mentions T1, and this was M104 that mentions T1. That was at the very beginning of the file. I just get rid of this comment because it like says the same thing. And actually, just my personal preference is I move this line 2 lines up. That's just some custom G code, don't worry about that. And another thing that is worth noticing is that you have this border here that's printed in first filament, and then you have another one printed in the second filament, this one here. And that kind of annoys me. I don't like this, so I get rid of this section. So basically I go to where this first one ends, which is right here, right before the tool change. This and this. And this is the last line. And there's a lift on the Z. So Z goes up. And then my nozzle goes to the next print position. And so I can get rid of this portion here. So the Z is lifted, and I get rid of this whole section and this one loop of filament. I go to the next tool change, and right after it finishes, here's how you recognize this. This is switching to tool 1 and then switching back to tool 0. This is the section that I delete. So just get rid of this portion and see how this green border now disappeared, and we're good to go. So now my Z goes up by 2 millimeters. My filament gets pulled in. I go to the next print position right here, lower the Z, push out the filament, and start printing. So that looks good, that'll work. But the main thing was getting rid of these 2 lines here, M104 for T1 and M109 for T1, because if you didn't get rid of these 2 lines, your printer would just get stuck and wait for extruder that's not there to reach its temperature. So you got to get rid of those 2 lines. You got to remember that. So now my hot end has reached its temperature, and the first thing that we need to do is feed in filament from extruder number 2, the second extruder. So I'm going to, actually I'll go slowly. I'm going to feed that extruder in until it comes out of the hot end.
And you could feed filament faster, but sometimes it like hits the walls and gets stuck, and the extruder has trouble feeding that in. So it's easier on your setup to do it slowly. So about 140 millimeters is the length of the full path between the PTFE tube that goes into the Y splitter and the tip of the hot end. So if I extrude 150 millimeters, then I should see some filament come out. And I do. I just noticed that a bit of red filament came out because that's what I had in there previously. So I'm going to feed it a little bit more just to make sure that I have green filament fully fed into the nozzle. And now that I do, I'm going to back out 140, but I'm going to cheat, and instead of going back 140, I'll go 150 and then feed 10 forward. It's just fewer clicks. Yeah. So back 100, back 50, and feed in 10. So that's the 140 number that you saw in the G code earlier. And now I'm switching to extruder number 1, and I'm going to again feed 150, and then maybe a little bit more to purge that green filament, and then I'll be ready to print. And in the meantime, my hot bed heated up and it's good to go. The extruder is good to go, so I'll be able to start printing. And if your Y splitter is smooth, you don't have any trouble feeding the filament in, then you could go with the fast feed instead of going slowly. Right. So that was 100, now 50. I'll go in increments of 10 until I see nice red. I see green filament coming out. And now red, but I'll feed 10 millimeters more. That'll do it. Alright, so now my filament, both filaments are in position, in correct position, and I can just hit print and let the magic happen. Alright, now the filament switch, you can see here the first filament being pulled out, and the second extruder is now feeding green filament, 140 millimeters. Now the purge tower for the green filament is being printed. And it looks like it didn't stick to my print surface. That's not good. That hasn't happened in a while. Well, hopefully it's stuck now. Hopefully it'll be clean and won't get into my print. Yeah, there's a big blob of filament right here. Eek. That's not good. So right now it's the red filament that's still coming out of the nozzle, so that's why that second bar is still red, but eventually green should kick in, and by the time this bar is done printing it should be green, and then the actual part will start printing. Now again, another layer of dump tower. We're not changing filament, but gotta keep the layers current, so it needs to add another layer. And then back to the print, do another layer, and now we're going full speed. Do another layer of green, and then there will be a filament switch to red, and 2 layers of red filament, and so on. Okay, so now switch. The green filament just came out, now the red filament is being fed in, 140 millimeters. And now red dump tower is being printed until it turns green. I'm sorry, green is being printed in green until it turns red. So yeah, that's how it works. That's pretty much it. The rest of the print, nothing really exciting. You'll just continue these layers until it's done. So that's how you can get the dual extrusion going. And in the next video, we'll talk about quad extrusion. That'll be exciting.